Yes, this is updating a lecture from 12 years ago now. And you would think immediately that I'm just rolling out the oldies, that I'm providing the same old lecture that I did before. But believe it or not, there have been some dramatic changes in this subject that we need to address. But to understand why there are historical fortifications in St. Bernard Parish, you must first have a full grasp and appreciation for the historical context. To do so, you have to go all the way back to the War of 1812. Now, when most people think of the War of 1812, they think of highlights but like the Battle of Lake Erie, the Battle of Chippewa in 1814, the burning of the White House by British forces in September 1814. They think about these moments, and they will sometimes think about also this thing called the Battle of New Orleans, but that's another topic. As a part of an overall offensive operation, an overall campaign, the British in 1814 also sought to capture Baltimore. And in doing so, they sent an expeditionary force toward the city that conducted an amphibious landing. And then after having done so, they brought up the fleet and began the process of bombarding the fort that you see in the drawing here, Fort McHenry. And you're probably all familiar with this, but Fort McHenry held out under bombardment, during which time a poem was penned that would ultimately become our national anthem. But it brings up an important point. I wanted to mention what happens at Fort McHenry, not just because this is the incident that gives birth to our national anthem, but because of the fact that this incident clearly and succinctly demonstrates the effectiveness of permanent fortifications. This is demonstrated at Fort McHenry in September of 1814, and it's demonstrated at other places, including places in the southern theater of the War of 1812, particularly at Mobile Bay, when almost simultaneous to the attack at Fort McHenry, you have a British force of Royal Marines with Creek Indian allies who conduct an attack at Fort Boyer on Mobile Bay, located at Mobile Point, where present-day Fort Morgan, Alabama is located. And during the course of their attack, they managed to destroy the HMS Hermes, seen here, blowing up spectacularly. An important detail, because this is the only British capital ship, the only major British warship that is destroyed by a fortification during the War of 1812. This is therefore an important moment. And an important moment that also underscores the incredible importance of a fortification. In the case of Fort Boyer, it's not a permanent fortification, but it's still important nevertheless. Now, when we consider this southern campaign during the War of 1812, we have to consider that it is a campaign that unfolds over a 300-mile of coastal littoral stretching from Apalachicola Bay to Barataria Bay in Louisiana. This 300-mile long box sees combat operations beginning really in August of 1814 and continuing through to the end of hostilities in February. And during that time, you have within this box a few clear-cut cases of why fortifications are very, very important for the national defense. The most important of these clear-cut examples comes as a result of the greater campaign that we sometimes refer to as the Battle of New Orleans. It's easy and convenient just to refer to the Battle of New Orleans as if there was one action on one day and that was it, a solitary military engagement, when in actuality there is this very interesting universe of different engagements that all kind of culminate with the main action just about a mile and a half from here at the Plain of Chalmette on January 8th of 1815. And it's important to understand the way that the British got to the Plain of Chalmette so that they could fight that battle, in addition to the many other actions that both preceded and then followed the January 8th, 1815 Battle of New Orleans. And the way that the British got there was they brought their ships, a fleet of about 35 warships. They anchored ships around Cat Island in Mississippi Sound and also around the Chandeleur Islands. They embarked their landing force aboard rowboats. They rowed 50 miles, basically from the Cat Island anchorage, into Lake Bourne. And as they entered Lake Bourne, they then directed themselves toward, I have it labeled here as Bayou Bienvenue, however at the time it was known as Bayou Catalan. They approached Bayou Catalan, entered the bayou, followed it to where it became, I guess it was at the time called Bayou Nazant. They followed it into the interior, all the way down to where it joined the Villeray Canal, which brought them directly down to the bank of the river and made it possible for them to turn in that direction and confront Line Jackson, which of course leads to the January 8th, 1815 battle that we call the Battle of New Orleans. This is an incredibly important moment that effectively describes and explains why there are fortifications located in this parish. There you see Old Hickory himself standing on the parapet in a rendering that is highly historically accurate. That was sarcasm. It's not historically accurate at all. You're supposed to laugh at that. We need an applause sign. There it is. Thank you. I'm here all week. Take your waiters and waitresses. Okay. So let's move on. The Battle of New Orleans, as I mentioned, not just one single action of universe, a constellation of different actions that would also then be followed by two other undeniable pieces of proof that fortifications are critical to the national defense. One of those pieces of proof begins the day after the January 8th of 1815 Battle of New Orleans, and that is when Royal Navy warships sail to the mouth of the Mississippi River. They sail up the mouth of the river where they reach a fortification that had been built by the Spanish in 1786, occupied by the United States, and then improved by the United States. The British warships anchored in the river at a point just over 2 miles away from Fort St. Philip, and then commenced a bombardment that would last during 9 days. And through 9 days of bombardment, those ships fired over 1,000 rounds toward Fort St. Philip, which held in the end. The objective overall had never really been to get past Fort St. Philip. The objective overall was largely simply a demonstration of force designed to convince Jackson that the British were still out there, the British were still dangerous, and the British still posed a threat to the city of New Orleans. Well, nevertheless, Fort St. Philip, built by the Spanish, occupied by American forces at the time of the battle, it holds under bombardment. This is another piece of proof that having a permanent fortification of some kind can hold the enemy at bay. And in this case, it certainly did so, with Americans in Fort St. Philip, also with gunboat number 63 at their side. Some shots in the event that anybody would like to see. This is kind of, these are pre-Katrina images, aerial images of Fort St. Philip, where you see Battery Pike, Battery Force, and Battery Merrill, concrete batteries that were built in the era of breech-loading rifles, concrete and steel, during the era of the First World War. So these batteries belong to a later period. The original Spanish fort, updated by the Americans, is just there. These aerials give you a little bit of an impression of what it looks like. I used to go down there all the time. I haven't been there since Katrina. I don't want to know what it must look like down there now. Has anybody been there? Since 2005, during the last decade? Okay, that looks like a no. Well, here are some images of what Fort St. Philip was looking like at the time. I realize that I'm talking about Plaquemine Parish at this point, but this is simply to situate your understanding, to reinforce and underscore the value of the three fortifications that are located in this parish. And Fort St. Philip is, for that reason, certainly noteworthy to this story, because there was actual combat here. An interesting detail to the architectural design of the fortification was that they made use of coquina that was used effectively as a mortar to fill in parts of the fortification, and in that way you can clearly pick out the parts of the fort that were Spanish construction. A very nice a very nice powder magazine. The powder magazine that's on site there was shot by me in this photograph in 2002 and shot by another photographer in 1935 from the exact same spot. So even in 1935, it was kind of overgrown. I haven't been there since 2005, so I'm imagining that things look probably pretty bad down there right now. But nevertheless, a very interesting place with a military history, and a military history that serves this overall point that I'm now mentioning to you for the umpteenth time. And that is, these fortifications have demonstrated themselves to be critically important during the War of 1812. Gun mount from the 1870s, when Fort St. Philip was modified and used in the latter part of the 19th century. Now, let's move on to a couple of others. There we go. Let's move back over to Mobile Point in Alabama. There's Fort Morgan, which you're probably familiar with. You may have seen before, maybe even you've visited. Fort Morgan, just outside of it, in the year 1813, the United States government built a fortification where the red X is located. Long before Fort Morgan was built in the 1830s, the fortification that used to sit where that red X is now on this image was called Fort Boyer. Fort Boyer, seen here in a watercolor that's held at the Historic New Orleans collection. Fort Boyer was garrisoned by a force of U.S. Army soldiers, 350 U.S. Army soldiers from the U.S. Army's 2nd Infantry Regiment under the command of a U.S. Army major named William T. Lawrence. William T. Lawrence and the soldiers inside Fort Boyer had fought the British off in this September 1814 attack, the one I mentioned earlier that dramatically and climactically resulted in the destruction of the HMS Hermes. Well, after the Battle of New Orleans, after I should say the campaign against New Orleans, stretching from December all the way through almost the end of January of 1815, the British left the field of battle in Louisiana, and they proceeded to Mobile Bay to have a second shot at Fort Boyer. And that second shot leads to a battle that is also noteworthy and interesting for the bigger point being made tonight. Here you're seeing Fort Boyer, not a permanent fortification, not a fortification made of brick and mortar, but a fortification made of logs, of earth. A fortification that had originally been imagined as being pretty elaborate and large scale, that in the end was a bit more modest than the United States had originally planned, and it was because simply resources were not available to build a more grandiose work. And so in the end, in 1814, when the first Battle of Fort Boyer is fought, and then in February of 1815, when the second Battle of Fort Boyer is fought, you have a fort housing 350 men, mounting 22 guns. Now, in 1814, the fort was perfectly up to the task of fighting off the British with their Indian allies and a handful of warships. What happens at this fort in February of 1815 is a bit different, in that when the British come back in 1815, they come back with a significantly larger force. Maybe even I should use the word vastly, a vastly larger force. A force numbering, they put over 3,000 people on the peninsula. At first, the British established a base of operations on Dauphin Island in Alabama, well, in what will ultimately become Alabama. They sail across Mobile Bay out of the range of the guns at Fort Boyer. They land at a place that to this day is known as Navy Cove. They put a force of 1,000 infantry ashore on February 8th, 1815. They establish an encampment, and then they begin advancing parallels toward Fort Boyer. They then land guns and mortars, and they bring those up, preparing for an overall push toward the fort, to capture the fort, to force the men inside of Fort Boyer to capitulate. On the morning of February 11th, 1815, Major Lawrence wakes up to find that the British have put a force ashore on the north side of the point. So this would be the Gulf of Mexico side of the point. This would be the Mobile Bay side of the point. The British have put a force here overnight. They have moved along the beach, sheltered by sand dunes. They have begun advancing a parallel. They did this overnight, February 10th, pre-dawn, February 11, 1815. And by dawn on the 11th, Major Lawrence inside the fort sees that the British have advanced a parallel that is within 40 yards of the walls of the fort. At that point, the overwhelming force of the enemy, the enemy's overwhelming presence, with a ground force of over 3,000 men, with 35 warships anchored just off Major Lawrence recognizes that it makes no sense to continue to fight, and then also importantly, the guns of Fort Boyer are oriented toward the west. They are oriented toward the body of water here, the ship channel or the entrance to Mobile Bay. And so the weapons inside the fort are not oriented to fight off an assault from its landward approaches. And it is for the series of reasons that Major Lawrence ultimately makes this decision to surrender the garrison. He does so in a ceremony on the morning of February 12, 1814, and the British are ready to move on to the next phase of the operation, which, just for the record, was to go back to and capture the city of New Orleans. So they fight this big January of 1815 battle just over here. Things don't go well for them. We do not militarily defeat them. Ron Chapman and I were just talking outside before I started, and the belief is that in the aftermath of this very bad day, the British still had over 10,000 men capable of fighting. So that is a very large force, a very dangerous force. It's still out there. It hasn't gone away. The war's not over yet. And so the British were moving on to an original plan, which imagined an assault on Mobile Bay, reducing Fort Boyer, proceeding on to the city of Mobile, landing that force of 10,000 men, and then they would simply follow the old Spanish Trail across what are now the three coastal counties of Mississippi and come back at maybe bypassing New Orleans and cutting it off by moving upriver to capture Baton Rouge. The point is that the British weren't going away. The war was still ongoing, and the British had every reason to believe that they were going to continue on toward the original objective, capturing the city of New Orleans. But then something kind of funny happened on Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day, 1815, the British are still here at Mobile Point, having only just 2 days before completed the ceremony by which Major Lawrence surrendered the garrison of Fort Boyer. And the British were there when suddenly the HMS Brazen pulls into view. HMS Brazen having sailed up from Aruba, carrying news that the war has ended, that the treaty has finally been signed, the Treaty of Ghent, in what was at the time the Austrian Netherlands, what we now call Belgium. And the Treaty of Ghent had ceased hostilities, and at that point the British had to abandon all objectives toward capturing New Orleans. And I mention this and dwell on it like this because it says something very important. There's a tiny earthwork fortification at the mouth of Mobile Bay. And although it's not much, and although it is garrisoned by a small force, that fortification is sufficient to upset the British timetable, so much so that by the time they finally deal with the fort and they've captured it, news of the war being over has arrived. It slowed them down. And that process of slowing down the British force is once again emphasizing, calling attention to the fact that these fortifications multiple times have proven that they are worth every penny. That in the event that a foreign enemy attacks our soil, these fortifications are worth their weight in gold because they offer opportunities for us to slow the enemy down and maybe even stop them. This has been demonstrated at Fort McHenry outside of Baltimore. It has been demonstrated at Fort St. Philip down the Mississippi River from the city of New Orleans. It has been demonstrated at Fort Boyer, not once, but really twice. Even though the second time the British ultimately won, we made them commit to a full investiture, yeah, that's it. We made them commit to a full siege operation. And the result of that siege operation was that they compelled the fort to surrender. But that commitment took time. And it took the better part of 2 weeks. Let's just say for the sake of argument that there had not been a fort at Mobile Point, that the United States had not taken the move of fortifying the spot that now Fort Morgan occupies. Let's say that it wasn't even there. How would the war have been different? Well, I think the war would have been dramatically different because I think that the British would have sailed over in September of 1814, as they did, and then with no opposition there, they would have sailed straight up to the city of Mobile. And that maybe you would have seen before New Year's 1815 some sort of campaign against the city of New Orleans, not a campaign that comes in through the lakes that are to the east of the city, but a campaign oriented toward the city's more vulnerable northern approaches. Well, that's contrafactual, isn't it? That's not how it ended up playing out. But I'm saying all this because I want to once again emphasize this point that Fort Boyer, although it was a temporary fort, That fort proved itself very, very valuable to us in holding off the British when they came here to capture the city of New Orleans. Fort Boyer, although it's not often thought of, it is central to the success that Andrew Jackson experienced on the plain of Chalmette on January 8th. Okay, so as we move into the immediate post-war time period, in the aftermath of the Treaty of Ghent, the Treaty of Ghent is ratified, I think it's February 17th, 1815, ratified by all 35 members of the Senate. Isn't that quaint to think at a time we had 35 Senate members? Signed all in one day, signed by the president that afternoon, and the British chef d'affaires was sent back to England within a matter of days, and the war's over with. And in the aftermath of this war, the United States must engage in an evaluation. It must engage in a strategic and tactical calculus. What did we do well? What did we do poorly? Well, the balance sheet was weighted kind of heavily to things that we did poorly. But among the things that gave us sort of a glimmer of hope were the performance of our fortifications. And in each case that I've mentioned here, Fort McHenry at Baltimore, Fort St. Philip on the Mississippi River, and Fort Boyer at Mobile Bay, in each of those cases, they're not fortifications that were built by the federal government. They were fortifications that were built under really 3 different regimes. So Fort St. Philip wasn't even built by the U.S., it was built by the Spanish. Fort McHenry was built by the city of Baltimore itself, so not part of the federal building program. And then Fort Boyer at Mobile Bay, it had been rushed into being by a U.S. Army unit who was sent there and told, build a fort and then protect the mouth of Mobile Bay. So one of the more important revelations at the end of the War of 1812 is we need a system of fortifications. We need a permanent system. And this is what we ended up building. And it was the most expensive undertaking in the history of the young United States of America. Beginning in 1817, the U.S. Army's Board of Engineers for Fortifications convenes. They then survey the coast. After this survey is completed, recommendations are made for places that need to be fortified. And in the end, the system that they build, it's really of the systems that are built in the United States to protect our coastline, it's the third of them. There was an early system that was isolated to localities. There was a second system that was after the Revolutionary War. And then finally, in the aftermath of the War of 1812, this permanent system is built, and we sometimes call it the third system of permanent fortifications. And this permanent system will consist of structures all the way from, stretching from Maine down the Atlantic coast, down the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and before the building program is terminated after the Civil War, it will even include fortifications on the U.S. West Coast in California. The Board of Engineers for Fortifications is led by a very interesting figure, a man who was a colonel under Napoleon Bonaparte named Simon Bernard, Simon Bernard if you're from Alabama, which is where I'm from, and that's how we sometimes say it. But Simon Bernard had been a colonel under Napoleon Bonaparte. He was given a generalship by the United States Army, and he was placed in charge of designing this permanent system. And so this French general, who was a graduate of the École Polytechnique in Paris, the official, basically French military engineering school, he came here and he personally assessed most of the locations where fortifications get built on the Gulf of Mexico, because this, believe it or not, for this very ambitious building program, this multi-million-dollar building program by the economic terms of the early 19th century, this program begins first right where you see inset B. And inset B is the area around the mouth of the Mississippi River, where you end up with a large number of structures, all of them contributing to the same overall goal, the defense of the port city of New Orleans. Now, as I've said, these forts are down the Atlantic coast, the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and even the Pacific coast. By the time that the system is finally terminated in the years after the Civil War, 46 separate structures have been built. Some of them you're probably familiar with. Some of them you may have, in fact, visited. These are structures, some of the closest ones to us, not counting the local ones, places like Fort Morgan, Alabama, Fort Pickens in Florida, The biggest one of them all is Fort Monroe at Virginia. One of the more infamous ones is Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. You've heard of these. Alcatraz was even a fortification built during this building program, the permanent system or the third system. Well, this program, when it swings into action, the first congressional appropriation funds building to protect New Orleans. Why would they come here first? They came here first and started building first because this area had been proven to be vulnerable. This area was very vulnerable to the attack of the British during the War of 1812. And it had only been just a few years earlier, just a handful of years earlier, that the British had basically rampaged around the area to the east of the city and to the south of the city of New Orleans. And so the first building program, the first structures authorized in this building program are started in the area basically where we live. And among the earliest, wait, I have to change that. And in fact, the earliest of this entire structure, of this entire system, the earliest work was commenced in St. Bernard Parish. Yeah, that's right. Go St. Bernard. Let's push on then. Permanent system. So here is the local area. You're seeing kind of a dense concentration of the forts that would ultimately defend the area. And although these are fortifications that are reaching to the Mississippi Gulf Coast, although it wasn't called that at the time, and reaching all the way to Alabama, although it wasn't called that at the time, these structures on places like Ship Island, Dauphin Island, Mobile Point in Alabama, they were actually there to defend the vulnerable approaches to the city of New Orleans. Now, those are the structures that are farther away. As a part of this permanent program, we get in Plaquemine Parish, improvements to Fort St. Philip, the old Spanish fort from the 1780s. We get a brand new fortification at Fort Jackson. Maybe you've been there. I understand it recently reopened, I think, in fact. We also get on Barataria Bay, Fort Livingston, which if you've never seen it, it's a fort that's kind of halfway falling into the Gulf of Mexico. It did not do very well during Hurricane Katrina. But then as we get closer in, you get other works, not just the Plaquemine Parish works. You get a couple of works that are nearby and part of the system that are in Orleans Parish. And I thought I would just mention them because we got some really awesome drone camera footage of it. And I want to show that to you because it's cool stuff. You'll see up there where the red X is located at Pass Rigoles, where there was actually fighting during the War of 1812, and a spot that I should have mentioned sooner, because during the War of 1812, located right there where the red X is, was another fortification, a temporary fort, a small, modest, a humble fortification called Fort Petit Coquille. Have you heard of this? The fort of the little shells. There were Indian shell middens nearby. And Fort Petit Coquille actually returned fire against the British before they came into Bayou Bienvenue, before they found, I shouldn't call it that, I should call it Bayou Catalan, as it was called at the time. Before the British sailed into Bayou Catalan, they actually sent an exploration team up here to the Pass Rigoles to see if they could get through. They drew a little bit of gunfire from Fort Petit Coquille, and they abandoned the chance. So there again, an example of a fortification doing brilliant work. Well, when the permanent system comes around, we build a brick and masonry fortification there at the Pass Rigoles. Of course, they've been there, Fort Pike. Fort Pike, which earlier this year closed to the public. I don't know if you've heard about that. It's a kind of a disappointing thing to learn that the state of Louisiana is no longer keeping this fort open for visitors. But still an interesting fort to visit, and there you see the bridge for, is that Highway 90? I guess that's the Highway 90 bridge, isn't it? Right there by the fort. It's a lovely structure, and it's in really good shape. It did quite well during Hurricane Katrina. Just 9 miles closer into New Orleans from Fort Pike at Pass Rigoles is another fortification from the permanent system. And here we see it right there at Pass Chef Mentor, another site where there was a minor action prior to the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815. And at this strategically perfect bend in Pass Chef Mentor, the U.S. comes in and builds ultimately Fort Macomb. For the first year or so, it was called Fort Wool, but then ultimately changed to Fort Macomb. I now call it Fort Tic Tac because they had put this big tic-tac-toe board out in the parade ground. I I don't know who's playing tic-tac-toe at Fort Macomb, but I suppose someone is. It used to be that the Orleans Parish Highway Department was storing supplies in this fortification and another fort that is not open to the public, which is a shame because this internal building you see here, this is an internal defensive barracks building that was built as part of the fort, and it's still there and it's intact. And out of the entire third system of masonry fortifications, this is the only defensive barracks structure that survives to this day. So it's kind of unique in terms of its cultural history. And I just wanted to show you these because they're neighbors nearby, just over the border in Orleans Parish. But now let's talk about what's going on in in St. Bernard Parish. So of course here we are. Campus is what? Right about there? We're right about there. Okay, so way down here on this southern extremity of Lake Bourne, at the mouth of that's Bayou Waclosky, isn't it? I think it is. So at the mouth of the bayou, where, by the way, there was a redoubt that was built at the time of the British invasion in 1814, 1815. And this redoubt, which was it was on the canal that extended down to, I guess it would be the Philippon plantation. That would extended along, was at Bayou Terre-Boeuf, as they called it at the time, and then there was a canal that extended down to the Philippon plantation. We were concerned as the British moved into the area beginning in December that they would try to find their way through these bayous to the east of the city of New Orleans off of Lake Bourne. And so a redoubt was constructed down there, and it kept the British away. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, we built a fortification there that maybe you're familiar with. It's, I think, one of the most handsome structures that you can see from the 18th century, the 19th century. Fort Proctor, sometimes named Fort Beauregard because Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard, he was the superintending engineer that oversaw the construction of this site. And so the fort goes under construction in 1856. Construction of Fort Proctor concludes in 1858, and Fort Proctor is different among all of the other forts from this system for one very, very distinct aspect. You see these iron beams throughout the fort? These beautiful iron I-beams. This is the only masonry fortification of the permanent system, the third system of fortification, to make use of iron support structure. Everything else is through and through completely brick masonry, or in some cases, way up in the northeast, stone masonry. But down here on the bayou, we built a grillage upon which the fort is built, and the grillage is little more than just logs that have been felled farther to the north. They're hauled down, and they produce a footprint more than 3 times the overall size of the fort. The fort is then built on top of this log grillage so that it won't sink into the marsh, which of course it then almost immediately began doing, because after all, it is swampy and marshy on Lake Bourne. And so the interesting thing is that Fort Proctor, Fort Beauregard, whatever you want to call it, the official Army name was Fort Proctor, so I suppose I should just call it that. Fort Proctor goes under construction in 1856. It's not occupied during the Civil War. The Confederates will eventually send some personnel down there. It's abandoned after Farragut sails up the Mississippi River in April 1862. And so it really doesn't play any kind of meaningful part in the Civil War. But then in the era after the Civil War, the fort is abandoned. So this fort really doesn't even have a full decade of military use. And it's because it's recognized that this site is less strategically important because it's so distant and remote from the city of New Orleans itself. And then also the terrain down there was just not suitable for a structure of this size. In fact, after the construction of Fort Proctor was completed, there was a period where you can see that they went in and they were already beginning to detect that the fort was sinking down into the marsh. And so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came in, and you see how these pillars, they look like they've been chopped off? That's because they chopped them off. They realized this fort it's too heavy. There's way too much iron and brick masonry in the structure. We don't need so much. Rather than make it 3 stories, let's reduce it to 2 stories. And so they literally cut off an entire story that was under construction at the time, dumped it off into the water around the fort, used it basically as some sort of a breakwater and as a dam to protect it from the elements. But very soon thereafter, the coastline began to recede out from under it. By the 20th century, by the turn of the 20th century, it's still on land, it's still on the lakeshore. It is surplused out, in other words, it becomes designated U.S. Army surplus property, and it is sold to a private owner in 1916 for the whopping sum of $2,500. That's kind of a lot of money in 1916 when compared to this other fort that's a little bit closer to home that they get for a bargain basement price of less than half that. But somebody buys Fort Proctor in 1916 for $2,500. If you want to go visit this today, it's got its challenges. You have to drive all the way down to Shell Beach, Louisiana, and get a boat and go out on the boat. There's no way to get there on foot from Shell Beach. And it makes for a very interesting visit because it's an extremely attractive place, a very handsome piece of architecture. Well, let's move on to the next St. Bernard Fort. Here's our local area once again. And down here, just south of the mouth of Bayou Bienvenu, another fortification was built that you've probably heard of. And there it is. It goes by many names. The official U.S. Army name, Tower Dupree, because it's at the mouth of Bayou Dupree. And Tower Dupree was contracted and went under construction in 1830, finished within about 2 years, and it was originally imagined as being a 4-story tall, almost like a tower bastion. Some people locally, perhaps you've heard of it, heard it referred to by this local name, Martello Castle. I remember when I first moved here, I was very confused by this because it's associating with an existing type of fortification that you see in places in Portugal, in Spain, at Spanish and British Gibraltar, and then also in the bailiwick of the British Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, Sark, and Helm. Those islands off the French coast, they all make use of circular towers that they call Martello towers, but they're always circular. They're not octagonal like Tower Dupree is, or should I say was. I'll get onto that in a second. At any rate, this is what it looked like prior to Hurricane Katrina. And when I made this visit, this was a visit in 2003. I think this was in 2003. You can see someone at a previous time built a fishing camp on the top of it. It used to be, when I would show these photos, I was slightly sensitive to issues about trespassing because it was private property, and so I kind of wanted to not advertise these photos. I'm not so worried about that now. But I pulled the boat up onto the point there. Just there's one side of it. I think this is where I slid in, tied the boat up, and walked on. And there's this little apron here just in front of the fort. This little apron was poured in, I think, when it was turned into a fishing camp. And you can see how the main entrance to the fort is somewhat lower than that little pier. The way I made entrance, there was a gate here that was fully locked. You see these cables hanging here? This is how I made entrance, because then you have, this is an embrasure, it's not just a window. This was the opening through which a cannon would point. I climbed up that cable and got inside that way, and I got these really cool photographs of what it looked like inside Tower Dupree at the time, the luxury accommodations for this fishing camp. This was after a big storm. There must have been some sort of big storm around 2002, maybe in, I don't know, maybe hurricane season 2002, but this place was wrecked up by 2003. You can see here's stairs that go down to the lower level. You can see they just basically capped the structure off and built it out. On the lower level, these are also embrasures, embrasure being the French word for opening. All of the features of these fortifications had French names, and it was because, after all, the man that designed almost all of them was French General Simon Bernard. And he came from the French school, and so everything had a French name. And so we call these embrasures. And they're not just windows. Like I mentioned before, the throating around the embrasure was made in a very critically important way, such that you could have the effective traverse and elevation of a cannon from within there, so that you could maximize the amount of space that the cannon could traverse and elevate, and then minimize the overall opening. And so that if you were under fire from a warship or from infantry on the ground, that very small opening would provide small, scant opportunities for the enemy's gunfire to come in through into your fort. But then you could fire quite easily and effectively traversing and elevating your weapon around. So you're seeing here two of the embrasures for the defensive armament of Tower du Pre. This wood was put in, I think, because they had sheetrock up as part of its conversion into a fishing camp. These are on the not the entry level, but the second level. You can see they came and put bunks in. Somebody made wooden bunks. There's one of the embrasures once again. They must have had them closed off when this was a functioning fishing camp. There are some of the bunks once again. There's, oh, look at that, even a mattress there, a lovely. Man, wouldn't you just like to lay down on that and have a nice nap? No telling what diseases are crawling around in that thing. A nice shot of one of the embrasures. I hate to keep heaping so much attention on this, but these embrasures, they really represented this incredible, this pinnacle level of achievement in architectural form and function, because they had to engineer. It took great skill and great sophistication to design this simple opening so that it was very small, but you could also get lots of traverse and elevation out of the gun. And so these really represent kind of the pinnacle of the art of the brick mason in the 19th century. And again, this is a structure that's going in under construction in the 1830s. On the lowest level, which would be the entry level, you're seeing these positions, and these, they look like cannon embrasures, but they're not. They're rifle loopholes, because on the lowest level, it was anticipated or imagined that maybe an infantry force would attack it from the ground, because although the 2003 photos don't really give you any indication, this fortification used to be on dry ground during the 19th century, and therefore an enemy could attack it from its landward approaches. And so on this lower level, you had the ability for riflemen with musket to put their weapons through these openings, these loopholes as they called them, and deliver fire against a land attacker. Now, an interesting point about this is that this is the lowest level. And here you can see it in 2003. You can't really tell, but this is water. This is water that's about 4 inches deep. And the rifle loopholes should have, when I stood on the lowest level in 2003, those rifle loopholes should have been right about here on me. But instead, they were, as you can see, way down here. And that's because the fort had really done a great deal of sinking and settling. This fort, just like Fort Proctor, also known as Fort Beauregard, was built on a grillage. In other words, the first thing that they did was they cleared the site, they laid down this very large grillage of logs, and then they built the fort on top of it, and it was thought that the grillage of logs would distribute the weight of the structure so effectively that it would not settle. Well, in each case, here at St. Bernard Parish, everything settled. Surprise, surprise. You build in St. Bernard Parish, you're going to get some settling. The Army learned that the hard and expensive way during the 19th century. And there you can see also some bunks that were put in from the era of when Tower du Pre was a fishing camp. How'd you like to be one of the kids? Like, no, you kids, you're sleeping on those metal bunks downstairs. That doesn't look like that'd be very glamorous, now does it? It was interesting to me, too, to see the remains of what had to have been a fantastic party. This appears to be Michelob Light. There's some Budweiser, the king of beers. But again, a rifle loophole from the original 19th century construction of the fort. You can see how on the entry level it's already awash with water. This is indicating the main problem that the U.S. government had from this structure from the time that they began it. From the time that they began it, they had these massive issues with the structure settling down into the soft terrain of the shore of Lake Bourne. Well, one last thought before I go away from that. At the end of the presentation, I have a video that I would like to show you. It's 10 minutes long, and it shows the condition of these fortifications today. We took a trip out, me, Curtis Manning, Phil Livaday, we went out on a boat, went out and did kind of a survey of these forts back in May. We took along a drone camera, and so we had some very impressive drone camera aerial shots of these structures. So at the end, please stick around. It's only 10 minutes long, but this video provides what I think is kind of a breathtaking view of what these structures look like today. And I have to go ahead and give away part of the end of the story here, because Tower du Pre, seen here as it appeared in 2003 when I made this visit, Tower du Pre no longer exists. This structure was, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say it was completely destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. All that's left out there today are some posts that appear to have been driven in for mooring posts. The bricks that made up the fort all kind of just collapsed down into one big rubble pile. And if you stick around at the end of the presentation for this 10-minute video that I just mentioned, you'll see some really dramatic shots of what this tower, or I should say what the remains of this tower looks like today. So please stick around until the end. Okay, now, as an introduction to the third and final St. Bernard Parish fortification that I'd like to talk about tonight, it's important to discuss briefly the British exfiltration operation at the end of the Battle of New Orleans. So I've already mentioned to you how the Battle of New Orleans is not one battle, it's a sequence of battles starting in December, stretching all the way really into February, if you count everything over at Mobile Bay. The main point of the Battle of New Orleans is, of course, the January 8th, 1815 action on the plain of Chalmette against Lyon Jackson, which was a British defeat. In the aftermath of this British defeat, an important point is that the British force, which remained very strong and very dangerous, a force of over 10,000 men, a force of several thousand sailors also backing them up, they remained in the area, and during the 21 days that follow the January 8th, 1815 Battle of New Orleans, they carry out this rather skillful and impressive exfiltration. They infiltrated into the area around the plain of Chalmette through Bayou Catalan in December, and then after the January 8th defeat, they exfilled. They pulled out from the area in good order, and for the most part, we let them get away. There was very little we could do against them at that stage of the war, but we let them slink off and carry themselves over to Mobile Bay to try to fight some more. But the route that they chose goes back to this point that I have now emphasized 1,000 times in this presentation, and that is that fortifications really proved themselves indispensable during the War of 1812, particularly during the campaign around the city of New Orleans during the closing weeks of 1814 and the beginning weeks of 1815. So, here we're seeing effectively the field of battle, the red indicating where the British were. I'm going to punch in a little bit. You're seeing here where the British on the West Bank experienced very dramatic successes that are often overshadowed by the big failure that happens here in front of Lyon Jackson on January 8th. And you're also beginning to see the British exfiltration route along the Villeray Canal. So, January 8th, 1815 is the big Battle of New Orleans, as we call it. The British remain in the area really until January 21st. It's not until January 21st that they are good and gone completely from the immediate area, from being ashore around New Orleans. Because in the aftermath of the January 8th battle, the British General Lambert is trying to make up his mind. There are a few days where he is trying to come up with a plan. They come up with the idea of this feint of sending the fleet up the Mississippi River to bombard Fort St. Philip. But then ultimately they begin pulling forces out. And this extraction, or this exfiltration, that's really the more appropriate word, this is a delicate and difficult operation because it's not going to just happen in a day. These are men that have to follow the canals out to the lakeshore. And there's, keep in mind, 10,000 of them. They're also carrying heavy equipment and supplies, and in some cases, wounded men. And once they get to the lakeshore, which is difficult enough, getting to the lakeshore is in and of itself quite challenging. But once they get there, they have to get in boats and row 50 miles to Cat Island to the fleet that's waiting for them, because the fleet can't come any closer. It's too shallow around Lake Bourne. And so the British began this phased pullout, following the rat line on the Villeray Canal to a spot where they built a redoubt there. And what I'm doing now is I'm wanting to emphasize the way that the British on this phased pullout built fortifications that greatly helped them. So we used forts, they helped us. The British built forts that were helpful to them. The second phase of the pullout then carried them here to the where the Villeray Canal intersects with Bayou Mezant, where here they had a redoubt, what they called a strong redoubt, and closing huts. The British then moved by foot on, it was called a corduroy road. Do you know what I mean when I say that? A corduroy road being a road basically of logs over marshy ground so that you can get good traction and you can carry heavy equipment. So following a corduroy road that was built on the marsh, on the bank of the bayou, they followed all the way along here to a crossing spot there that was effectively a pontoon bridge. This pontoon bridge was protected by a breastwork manned by riflemen, or pickets as they called them. They then continued along the bayou to another pontoon crossing, also protected by a breastwork, that is here where Bayou Bienvenue or Bayou Catalan divides off into Bayou Jumonville. From there, the British moved, continuing along to the big, very characteristic and pronounced bend in Bayou Bienvenue, called Bayou Catalan at the time, across a corduroy road spanning the Big Bend to a 1,000-man fortification that they built there. It was a temporary fortification, an earthwork. But this earthwork provided protection for this withdrawal. Once they got to the big 1,000-man earthwork, they fell back to the fisherman's village, where they embarked aboard their rowboats and then rowed back out to the fleet, 50 miles all the way to Cat Island. How would you like to do that in the dead of winter on open Lake Bourne? Sounds like fun, doesn't it? So, this rat line that led them out, led them up the Villeray Canal, along Bayou Mezant, and then along Bayou Bienvenue, which at the time was called Bayou Catalan, of course. And so it's unsurprising that this little avenue here, Bayou Bienvenue, Bayou Mezant, it's unsurprising that in the aftermath of the war, we recognize this spot as being of the utmost importance. And it is therefore unsurprising that in the aftermath of the war, during the era of the permanent system or third system of fortifications, it's unsurprising that we put a fort there, isn't it? And it's the final of the forts I wanted to speak to you about tonight, and it's also my favorite because it's extremely exciting. It's called Battery Bayou Bienvenue. Has anybody been there? Okay. Get a couple. Zooming in on it from space, you can see here, there's that building, which is the powder magazine that is located at the fort to this day. The fort was effectively a masonry wall, 600 feet long, behind which cannon would be mounted. In the inside of the walled-in area was a powder magazine that's still there to this day, a barracks building for the soldiers, officers' quarters, and then a mess building. Those structures are gone because they weren't as ruggedly built as the powder magazine, obviously, but they're still, foundations are still at the site to this day. This is the back side of the powder magazine, all overgrown. That's what it looks like from a distance. These are some of the foundations of officers' quarters, barracks, and then that mess facility that I mentioned. This site goes under construction, or the contract is issued in 1826. The site is completed in 1828 and occupied by the United States military, and it will remain occupied with the military until 1884. This stands in interesting contrast to Fort Proctor and Tower Dupree, forts that almost as soon as they were built, they were recognized as not being particularly useful. And yet the U.S. Army continues to use this fort all the way into the 1880s. The U.S. Army doesn't sell this as surplus property until 1930. Anyway, some more shots of what it looks like. Here is what it looks like from just offshore. This is from a visit in 2003, just for the record. It doesn't look like this now. You don't see those nice fishing camps. You see that fishing camp off in the distance there? Not there anymore. Surprise, surprise. You see also the ski jump? Okay, Curtis, this is the photo I told you about. So this is looking straight out. That's Bayou Bienvenue as it goes out toward Lake Bourne. This fishing camp, that fishing camp. Those camps used to be there, but they're not there anymore. They were there in '03. There are only some of those support structures, those support beams, they're still sticking out of the ground, but that's really it. That's all that's out there now. We were just discussing how someone may have, as recently as the year 2000, had been living permanently out there, which I think would have been a wonderful way to exist, especially during those summer months. There wouldn't be a bug problem out there that I would think of. The big surprise about Battery by Bienvenue, and the thing that I find most impressive, and the thing that I find that is the subject of my great infatuation with the site, is that 6 of its original guns are still there. Now, the fort was armed after its completion in 1828. It was armed for the most part with weapons different than the ones that are there now. But it was eventually, in the years immediately after the Civil War, immediately before the Civil War, about 1857, it was armed with 6 weapons, the 6 weapons that remain there today. This, during my visit in 2003, where you can see I just pulled the boat straight up right to where we pulled up with Phil. Isn't that the same spot? Where we pulled up to, I pulled up by myself, tied off, and climbed up there, where I got the first and worst case of poison ivy in my entire life. During the day I took these photos, very memorable, but it was worth it, because these cannons are incredible. It's absolutely incredible to see pre-Civil War guns sort of in their natural habitat. Now, they're not mounted in the way that they would have been mounted during the time period of the American Civil War. Because you can see here in this case, this is, of course, that's the one, the special one. This is model 1839 42-pounder Seacoast Defense Gun, serial number 1. Made by the West Point Foundry. The West Point Foundry only made a dozen of these model 1839. They were a special gun that was meant to be a little bit lighter, and they only made a dozen of them and they quit making them. This is serial number 1, the first one they made. And so at some point, I believe it was in 1959, somebody came in and poured some concrete and mounted the guns on their trunnions, just so you know the anatomy of a cannon. That you have the tube itself, and then you have this projection on the side there that is cylindrical. It allows the weapon, it is basically what the weapon is mounted on. All of the weight of the weapon is on a trunnion on one side and a trunnion on the other side. And so the weapons, all 6 of them, were mounted on these little concrete things because they were just lying in the dirt prior to 1959. The Army, in a report, the report would have been from 1869, the Army 1869 report described how there was extensive vandalism at this site, because although the Army would build these sites, the plan was not that they would have a permanent garrison. The Army did not plan that they would be occupied by soldiers at all times, through all seasons, through all 12 months. The plan was that they would have a superintendent that lived somewhere locally whose responsibility was to go and check on them and to ensure their upkeep and to cut back growth wherever necessary. And that in the time of a national emergency, the Army would then rush people to them, occupy them, and until that national emergency expired, they would remain there. But then when the emergency passed, they would go home. You have a very interesting example of how the system worked in 1873. Have you ever heard of this little thing called the Virginius Affair? The Virginius was an American registered ship, registered at the port of New Orleans, actually. And the Virginius was sailing to Cuba. And in 1873, Cuba was in the middle of this, I can't say civil war, because it was a colonial territory of the Empire of Spain. And the Spanish were fighting off this movement, this freedom movement, that would ultimately come to be known as Cuba Libre, the Free Cuba movement, and it would ultimately result in the intervention of the Spanish-American War in 1898. But in 1873, there's this little flashpoint where the Virginius is sailing from the U.S. down to Cuba, carrying arms, carrying weapons, carrying a whole bunch of surplus Civil War-era rifles and muskets. The plan is that they're to land at some remote beach, dump off all the guns. The guns would be then distributed among the Cuba Libre freedom fighters. Well, that would have been great if it had not been for the fact that the Spanish Navy intercepted the ship before they got to Cuba. The Spanish Navy then took the crew off, took the captain, who was an American citizen from New Orleans, Louisiana, and they executed it. And it created a little bit of an issue because the United States protests. There's a moment in this deep chill runs between the U.S. and the Empire of Spain over this incident because they've just killed an American citizen. And during this time, the United States suddenly thinks we need to show the Spanish what we're all about. How we're still tough guys. The reality was in 1873, we weren't really that strong. We couldn't have taken on the Spanish Empire, but we wanted to put on a pretty good show. And what we did was we rushed people down to occupy some of the forts on the Gulf of Mexico, acting like we were preparing for some military intervention that never managed to materialize. Nevertheless, what it indicated was that we had major problems with all of these old forts that had been built in the early 19th century that by 1873, under these like caretaker sergeants, they were not doing well. And Battery Bayou Bienvenue is the perfect example of that because the battery was still there, it was still armed, but vandals would go out to it periodically. And the description in this report Curtis gave me is very interesting because the vandals went in there, set fire to a few structures, and they burned the carriages for the guns. Each one of these guns was mounted on a wooden carriage, and the carriages were all burned. So these guns, as of 1870, were just laying in the dirt. And they remained there, I think, undisturbed until 1959 when somebody, I still don't know who, went in and built these little concrete supports to get the cannons up off the ground. And the only reason I think 1959 is because somebody took a little pencil or something and etched into the concrete before it was dry, 1959. So, brilliant deduction on my part, isn't it? Anyway, here is number 135, my favorite gun at the site. Number 135 is especially interesting because its markings are very, very crisp. The weapons are absolutely impressive to see. And for those of you who have been out there, maybe you'll agree with this. 135 is great because you see number 135. You've got a really crisp and deep trunnion marking there, RPP, WPF. RPP, Robert P. Parrott, who was the superintendent of the West Point Arsenal, or the West Point Foundry, and the WPF, West Point Foundry. The weapon was made in I think this one was made in 45. This gun that was also made at Fort Pitt, a model of 1829. There's the single model 1839 42 pounder. And just for the record, the 42 pounder Seacoast defense gun in the year 1839 was the largest weapon in the inventory of the military of the United States of America. It's kind of an interesting point. We then have, and I think the other three are all model 1845 42 pounders. And so those 6 guns are still out there to this day. And it's an incredible thing to see, and a very important part of the rich history of this parish. And one last thing before I sign off. If anybody is tuned in to the American Heroes channel tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, be sure to tune into the next exciting episode of America, Facts versus Fiction, where we will investigate the history and background of Dwight David Eisenhower. This is one of my shows. If you get a chance to watch it, it's on tomorrow night. I just had to make one last bit. Thank you very much. Now we're going to roll the video, all right? If anybody wants to stick around, we've got this 10-minute video that's going to play. I'm probably going to stay up here because a few things on our picture. There you can see me making bold fashion choices. Curtis applying sunscreen. All right, here we go.
Looking quite cool.
And Captain Phil Everyday in the background there, our hero. Don't mind the music, okay? This is only for a few seconds. It was kind of a fun perspective. The last time I had gone out to these forts was before Katrina. And notice this structure in the background there? See that? The last time I'd been out there, none of that was there. It was kind of overwhelming to sail out and see the big flood control gates. Pretty impressive sight. And that's what it looks like when you approach Battery Bayou Bienvenue. It doesn't look like much. As you sail up to it, it just looks like a couple of areas of dense bushes. But when you get close enough in, you can see the masonry. And the masonry part here is the part of the fortification that is facing to the east. In other words, facing directly down Bayou Bienvenue. So that in the event that the British came back and followed the same path that they had followed in December of 1814, if they had done so after 1828, they would have seen this masonry wall. At the time that the fort was completed, it was somewhat taller, but the years have not been too kind to Battery Bayou Bienvenue. Nevertheless, even in the 21st century, you can pull the boat right up to it and step right off the bow into the fort. An interesting thing to note is that the difference in time between 2003 and 2015 was that it's almost impossible to see the guns until you're on top of them. In 2003, you could see them from when you're in the water. But now when you get out to the site, the guns are obscured. This is what number 135 looks like today. Number 135 is so grown that you can barely get around it. Whereas my photos of it from 2003, you can see there's not much growth around it. It was largely cleared out. I wouldn't want to shoot it now, of course. And what you're seeing there, 1837, the person that put the video together made the mistake of putting 1837 for the fort. The fort was commissioned somewhat earlier than that, in 1828. That gun was just was given its proof testing in 1837. That's why the number 1837 appears on the left trunnion. It was the day of floppy hats. And this is the part that I think you're really going to enjoy. So we took an operator with a drone out, and we got some pretty spectacular footage from above Battery Bayou Bienvenue. So the structure that you're seeing just there, that is the powder magazine. No, I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. That's the officer's quarters. That's the foundation of the officer's quarter. The powder magazine should come up right there as he pans around. There's Phil's boat. And you can basically see the outline of that wall as it faced right down the bayou. And this is looking down Bayou Bienvenue toward Lake Bourne off there in the distance. You can see that's where those fishing camps used to be. There's one spot there. There's the old officer's quarters right there. And so you can see this is basically where the wall of the fort starts, where you see the bigger bushes, the taller bushes. That's where the fort is. That's looking roughly south from Battery Bayou Bienvenue. Again, the remains of the officer's quarter. Just off to the side of the screen there where you see some growth, that would be the barracks. This is the powder magazine from above, looking back toward the city of New Orleans. You see the remains of where the fishing camps used to be that are long gone, a distant memory, courtesy of Hurricane Katrina. And there you see your parapet, the main masonry wall. Number 135 is right about there. And again, the remains of the officer's quarter. It's really grown up a lot in the years since Hurricane Katrina, making it a little bit of a challenge to get around back in there. But nevertheless, there's some surprising history in here. There you see Dr. Manning, somewhat interested in the presence of, I think, tube number 1. That's the model 1839 42-pounder. You see the cascabel, that's the back of the gun. It's been chopped off, a typical manner of deactivating a weapon of this type. It would also spike the vent hole of the weapon right there. Although these vent holes have not been spiked, the cascabel is missing on 2 of the 6. And here you can see the concrete that was poured in the 1950s to get the guns up off of the ground. This one, I believe, is the 24-pounder, the smallest of the guns at the site. And and then someone involved in a way too detailed explanation of something. This one, interesting. Colony of bees is now home for one of these, is now accommodating, is now inside one of these guns. Non-aggressive bees, they wouldn't even fly out to investigate us.
Were the forts built by the Spanish?
All of these forts that you're seeing here were built by the United States government in the 19th century. So after the War of 1812. Here we come up on the true sad detail of the night, the bittersweet moment where you see Tower Dupree, or rather what's left of it. Do you remember the photos of what it looked like in 2003 when I went out there? Still a 3-story tall structure. I think the only reason you're seeing anything above the surface now at Tower Dupree's site is because there was a platform built, I think in the 1980s when this was converted into the fishing camp, and you can see how the whole structure just collapsed in on itself. And I think the only reason that all that masonry is above water is it just kind of collapsed in on top of that little dock area up here. And this is the point why we felt like it would be nice to provide an update about these structures, because here's one that we lost because of Hurricane Katrina. That storm took a lot away from all of us, didn't it? It also took something very important away from our cultural heritage. So I kind of mourn the fact that we lost Tower Dupree. You know that we also lost the Chandelier Light, skeletal, beautiful skeletal lighthouse, completely washed away. This lovely drone shot of the remains of Tower Dupree. Just a big, ugly pile of bricks now. It used to be that, even in its old age, it was still a pretty attractive piece of architecture, and look at it now. And part of the reason why I wanted to show you some of this and show you these angles that you can only get from a drone camera, and that's to say, what happened to this structure could also happen to Battery Bayou Bienvenue. I think it's not unreasonable to imagine a future in which all of the guns at Battery Bayou Bienvenue are underwater. I think it's therefore also not terribly unreasonable to think that Fort Proctor might suffer some long-term damage. Fort Proctor stands a better chance because of all that iron superstructure inside the fort holding the masonry together. And in fact, of the 3, Fort Proctor seems to be doing the best. It's settling, of course, but it's also looking pretty good. And we had to save the best to last because this is where we got the best drone footage. The drone footage is pretty cool, isn't it? Yes. It looks good. It looks really good. It was a very good use of resources to go out there and to capture these forts before the next big hurricane comes along and takes another one away from us. I just wish that there had been drones in 2003 when I went out to Tower Dupree, because I had this of that when it was still standing. And here's the big moment of launch. That was a good launch. Before the day was over, we had a bad launch. That drone, we lost that drone that day. On our last shot of the day, we got into some wind and the drone bit the dust big time. But before we lost it, look at how awesome these shots are. This piece of architecture is stunning. The use of the granite, have you noticed how there's a granite piece covering the main entrance, or what they call the Sally Port? They have this granite mortising throughout. You can see the iron structure. There's been a little bit of collapsing going on. We kept teasing him and asking him, just fly it straight through the door, fly it straight through there. He wouldn't go in. He stopped right at the door and then pulled back. Still looked pretty cool though. And that's Shell Beach off in the distance. And one. Really, the spot that made all of these structures so historically important, because this was how the British came in 1814. Well, thank you very much for coming out tonight, everybody.